from an author standpoint, I go by Dorothy Bunting. Montgomery Bunting is my maiden name, and I share that because I grew up in the Anamosa area, very close to Stone City and the Biola community. So Elaine and I actually grew up together. We were in the same class, same grade. So as I talk about Stone City tonight, I'm going to talk a little bit about my journey with Stone City, but also just my enthusiasm for Grant Wood and some of the native sons from Iowa, being Paul Engel, as well as many other names you're going to hear tonight. And please feel free to ask questions. Feel free to, Elaine, I'll let you run chat. It doesn't bother me if people ask questions during the session. I've got a lot of material to cover. You'll probably see me looking at my notes because there is so much I want to share with you about this incredible place. And you can see tonight I titled it Where an Artist's Dream Comes True. And Paul Jewell, you'll probably recognize that title a little bit. Paul is definitely someone I look to for a lot of the things I'm going to share with you tonight, as well as Barbara and Elaine. So once again, feel free to jump in. But I want to start with this quote by Grant Wood. It's one of my favorite because I feel like it really defines a lot of our upbringing around the Anamosa area. But Grant said, my early work is a result of going around that very territory where I lived and not seeing it. And like I said, I love this because I feel like this is just, so many of us can relate to it, right? We grew up in places, maybe at the time we thought we appreciated it, but maybe not as much as we do today when we look back at those special people, those special memories, those special places. And especially too, whether you stayed around the Anamosa, Cedar Rapids area, or you left it and came back, I think you find that these places have a lot of, they provide a lot of the heart and soul that we all feel for home. And so I love that quote. But I want to really start with talking about Stone City in three lenses. And the three lenses actually comes from a piece that was written in 1968 by an author by the name of Joan Maiskens. And she wrote the Annals of Iowa. And she described Stone City as having really three lives. Or three significant periods. And that was when it was founded and was flourishing, to the Stone City art colony, to where it is today. It kind of came back, finding its roots in the quarries. I'm going to talk a little bit about its beginnings, its middle, and where it is today by sharing with you some of the incredible people that have graced this landscape. So what you see in front of you is an early depiction of the Dearborn quarry. That's the main quarry that we all know today in Stone City. And I want to talk about some of these founding fathers. But Stone City really began in the 1850s with the discovery of large deposits of limestone. And in fact, that limestone was found just west of Anamosa, and often those quarries were called the Anamosa quarries. And it wasn't until Stone City created a post office or established one that they started to call these quarries in this area more the Stone City quarries. So it started in the 1850s. A lot of people came to this area. They were stone cutters. They were people who worked on any kind of stone type of, what's the word I'm trying to think of, masons, but had a lot of background in this. And when you think about this little town, it was really a very wooded area. There weren't a lot of people. The settlers were just starting to come west. And here they found limestone and really created a wonderful place built around that stone. So it was back in the time when it started, you had a lot of great settlers. One of them was Henry Dearborn. In fact, Elaine and I went to school with a lot of the descendants of the Dearborns. But basically, Henry Dearborn was from Hampshire. He came west in a covered wagon, married his sweetheart, who you actually see him and his wife there in the picture that you see just off to the right. And they built what was called the Dearborn Mansion. And as I take you through some of these settlers, I'm going to show you a lot of these buildings, these structures that they built, because eventually I'll bring it all together into the landscape painting of Stone City. But he built this home about 1861, added an addition in 1863. But this was after he had started really building out his quarry. And here you can see what's called the blacksmith shop. This is actually depicts the entrance to his quarry. This structure still stands today. And it actually started with the main floor, which was basically housing his horses. And it wasn't until much later that on the second floor, he put offices. The first post office was out of here. And really, once again, it was very much a business office building for the business he was building. So his home, or the mansion, the Dearborn mansion, would have just been to the right, your right, just over the hill. And once again, right at the entrance of one of the main quarries here in Stone City. Then here depicts the road, which came through Stone City right about middle 1850s. In fact, it was 1859 when they built the first bridge over the Wapsipinicon. This is the railroad track over the Wapsipinicon. Many of you know this view. This is looking eastward toward the general store that's still there today. But it was really interesting that it originally started out to be the Dubuque Southwestern Railway. And it wasn't until 1892 that they sold to the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad. Sometimes when you hear about Grant Wood leaving Anamosa and heading to Cedar Rapids, this would have been the railroad that he would have traveled on to head between the great cities of Anamosa and Cedar Rapids. And when you think about it too, the quarries were known as or Stone City was known for being a town that sold the most commodities, the most products outside of the state of Iowa. Actually sold the stone to 8 different states, even as far as Montana. And so there's quite an industry here, quite a lot of money being transported back and forth. In fact, they said the rail cars were small, and that basically the stone in those rail cars were worth about $20. But over years and years' time, they ended up shipping about 225,000 carloads of stone worth, believe it or not, $4.5 billion. And this isn't the first time I read that they were making money in the billions collectively. So this was quite an operation coming out of the small, quiet, sleepy little town. And so the people who worked in the quarries were either people in the local area. Sometimes they were the convicts that were in the nearby penitentiary of Anamosa. Even people from Marion, Iowa would come out on train to work here in the quarries. So it provided a lot of jobs and opportunities for people in the local area. And many of you know the General Store and Pub is still in existence today, but came into existence in 1893. And it was the second post office. In fact, the first post office began in 1873. So that's when it all became the Stone City area, the Stone City quarries. And in this General Pub, these were, once again, the main offices for the Dearborn quarries. It was actually a railway depot, had a lot of uses, and especially during the time of Grant Wood's art colony, a lot of the artists came into this area just to hang out at the local pub. And I had just told you that a lot of the stone was sent and shipped outside of Stone City, even outside of the state of Iowa. Where the stone first was shipped to was actually Mount Vernon, Iowa. The stone was used to build Cornell College. It actually went to areas like Dubuque. It went up to Cedar Falls. It went as far as Montana. And one picture that I want to show you, it even went as far as Los Angeles. So Stone City stone was used to build the Disney Concert Hall. And this is in downtown LA. And I just had to sneak in this picture because I work 4 blocks from here. So it goes to show no matter where you go, no matter where you live, Stone City stone somehow follows you somewhere. So another magnate that came to this area was John A. Green. Remember I said the post office started in 1873? Well, guess who named the town Stone City? It was John A. Green who actually named it. And of course, one of the things that was wonderful about John Green, not only did he start the Champion quarries, but he gave back a lot to the community. And that's what I'm going to show you in some of these next slides. But he built Green Mansion, which many of us are familiar with. This is where the Stone City Art Colony place was on these grounds and inside the Green Mansion. He also built what's called Columbia Hall. And this was his way to give back to Stone City. In fact, he made this incredible building. It had 54 rooms. It served as a hotel. It served as a bank, a tavern, and an opera house. And he basically ensured that his employees stayed employed in downturns and economic depressions. He made sure that people always in the Stone City area had a place to work, a place to serve their community. So basically, when Greene was done with building his empire, he had 2,000 acres, and not only where Greene Mansion stood, which is about 10 acres, but also in adjoining quarries that he owned. And what's incredible about the Columbia Hall, and I'm going to put this out to all of you, is there's a couple of folklores that said that General Tom Thumb came and performed here at Columbia Hall. And also Jenny Lind, who was an opera singer. She was known as the Swedish Nightingale. Both of them toured with P.T. Barnum. But here's the question I have for this group. They say that both of them performed here, but I'm going to question that tonight, because what I found is that Jenny Lind, if this was built in 1883, Jenny Lind was actually she was married at that time. She was starting to retire. You could say she was in ill health. And she ended up dying in England in 1887. So the time frame of when she would have come through and possibly sang at Columbia Hall doesn't really add up. But maybe all of you know something I don't know. But when I look at the time frames, it's possible she came and sang in Stone City, but I don't think it was during the 1883 or beyond time frame. So I'm just going to kind of put a little prick in that myth around when she came and if she actually performed here. The other thing with Columbia Hall that's really interesting is that John A. Greene brought a group of brothers from New Orleans to really create this incredible artwork inside the Opera House and inside this building. They were called the Cox Brothers. They were out of New Orleans, and they were basically known for being great creators of things like scenery for like a stage. They actually did all kinds of pictures around landscapes, wood scenes, street scenes, all kind of building up this wonderful feel and look for an opera house. And I'm going to show you too a little bit of their work. I'm going to go all the way past here. But here are the Cox brothers. Eugene Cox, Frank was the older brother, and Clark Cox. And not only did they help John A. Greene with creating this incredible, beautiful opera screens and even, you could say, backgrounds and scenery. This is some of their work actually from an opera house in Colorado, but done about the same time they would have done this in the Stone City area, is that the brother Clark Cox also helped design a lot of the interior for the Greene Mansion. So it's interesting, just all the opulence, all the artwork that you would have seen around Columbia Hall, that you would have seen in Greene Mansion, and just the type of people that came through town to help build this town, I think is just really, really incredible. So then around 1913, there was a need for a church. And a lot of the church services had been in Greene Mansion. They had been in Columbia Hall, but there was a lot of Catholics in the area. And so they built St. Joseph's Catholic Church. And of course, you can see it was made out of Stone City stone. John A. Greene once again provided the stone. So did Henry Dearborn. And I just love the look and feel of St. Joseph's Church. The one thing that I researched and found was that St. Joseph, the saint itself, is known as being a saint of workers. I never knew that. I thought that was perfect to have a saint name graced on a church in this area of Iowa where people work so hard. But also the month of March is the month that celebrates St. Joseph. So how perfect that we're talking about this tonight. But this was an incredible piece of work too. And it was done by an architect by the name of, why can't I say his name? Weidelbeck. He was a Dubuque architect, but actually all his schooling was in Germany. In fact, he went to Stuttgart and the University of Heidelberg, but came into the United States, came into Rock Island, where he worked as a stone cutter at the governmental arsenal. But he became this incredible architect who built a lot of the churches across Iowa. And so he's quickly learned kind of the American style of architecture, but he brought with him kind of that Gothic revival look and feel with the pointed arches and, of course, the soaring steeples. But I think, once again, here's this great talent embracing this little town in Iowa, building this incredible church here in the city. So at this time, you've got all of these awesome buildings in Stone City, which we still see today. Of course, one of them too is Green Mansion. But at the turn of the century, as many of you know, the Portland cement came into being and replaced a lot of the use for limestone. And of course, profits on the quarry started to dwindle. They started to fold up. And in fact, in 1920, John A. Green left Stone City, sold his acreage. Eventually, the business was sold and he moved into Cedar Rapids. And what's really interesting at that time, a gentleman by the name of Frank Nissen, I'm going to ask you to remember that name tonight, actually bought the 10 acres that the Green Mansion sits on, as well as the water tower and the ice house. So when you think about the time that Grant Wood painted American Gothic, he painted it in 1930. And what was interesting, you could say that he captured the blacksmith shop that was built in 1851. Remember, Henry Dearborn built that to house his horses, put in a second floor. So you could kind of guess that maybe this was the blacksmith shop. And then, of course, he depicted the general store. That makes sense. That would have been standing there in 1893. So he captured that. And then, of course, he captured here at the far left, the St. Joseph's Catholic Church, 1930. Makes sense. But I want to ask all of you, did you ever get curious about what's not in the picture? So you can see in white, he doesn't have the Ridge Road. Many of us know that Ridge Road, and like Paul Jewell talked about a while back, that Ridge Road was a key road that settlers came across. They crossed the Mississippi, they found that Ridge Road that helped them get above all of these rolling hills and it helped them head west. It's interesting that he didn't depict that in the painting. I think it's interesting too that he didn't have the Dearborn Mansion on the painting. And in fact, I asked one of his descendants, Henry Dearborn's descendants, if the family knew why. And they kind of joked, they said, well, maybe there was a rift, or maybe, you know, we always heard that maybe there was someone in the family that Grant would, or maybe they left the mansion out just to kind of get back to the family. But she said, we don't know that for sure. And then I think it's interesting, you think that there might have been a trace of Columbia Hall, which actually was taken down in 1930. All the stone went to Cedar Rapids, I believe, and Paul, correct me if I'm wrong, but it created some apartments in Cedar Rapids. But you would have thought that maybe he would have put Columbia Hall in this painting, at least some remnant of it, but you see that he didn't. And then I think it's interesting too, that he didn't depict the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad. So it's almost fascinating what he decided to put in the painting versus what he left out of the painting. I'll open it up to, yeah.
Since you've got the Stone City up, one of the criticisms that a farmer had at the time he first saw it was the fact that it appears as if corn or wheat is in shocks, and over here the corn is just growing. And he said that's impossible for a farm seasonally to have both. So I just throw that out. I don't know any more about it than that.
Yeah, that's good.
Oh, that's interesting. Hey, there's a question in the chat from Nancy. You wanted to know if the Dearborn Mansion was ever a B&B?
Right.
No, it's been owned by the family. The family has lived there since the day Henry Dearborn had created it. So yes, there's family members living in there today. So it's never been a B&B that I'm aware of, but the family has lived in that house. Go ahead.
I was just going to say there was a huge mansion somewhere above Stone City, but it may not have been as close to Stone City as I thought it was, because I haven't been there for years. But I thought it was a B&B. I know I went to a luncheon in a mansion somewhere close by, and I think it actually burned.
And actually, that B&B that you're talking about, see where the words the Ridge Road is at? Yes. There was the Ronan Mansion that was up there. That was a B&B.
Okay.
And then the one, no worries. And the one that burnt down was possibly Green Mansion. I know the Ronan one's still there because we had someone just visit there just last fall. Okay. But it was the Green Mansion that actually burned down.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah. No, very good.
And we got one more question. Oh, what year did Grant paint Stone City?
1930, and he painted it right before American Gothic, same year as American Gothic. Yeah. So I want to give Paul Jewell credit for this next piece because he was reminding me of this. But Nan Wood Graham, in her book, My Brother Grant Wood, wrote this. Grant was an adult when he first saw Stone City. Sturdy stone structures, reminders of past grandeur, rose from dense underbrush in a restful, peaceful setting along the quiet Watsapinican River. The rolling hills were an artist's dream come true. Grant painted Stone City in 1930, and the little village was in his mind basically as the idea of an art colony took shape. So he was thinking about an art colony. He started to get those ideas in his mind as he's painting this. And I thought that was terrific. And I'm going to come back to that art colony piece here in a moment too. But I want to right now take everybody's attention over to the billboard that you see in the far right of the painting. When you actually see this at the Joslin, you can read the billboard, and it does say it satisfies. And I was asking Paul the other day, what was the ad that was on that billboard? And Paul reminded me that was the Chesterfield ad. And it was a man smoking a cigarette, basically, in a bright red tie. And but the reason I believe Grant chose that billboard was to say this landscape satisfies. In fact, this was his ideal landscape. And for many of us from the Anamosa area, you know, we would look at something like this and say, it doesn't look anything like that. We don't have those round trees, and you know, we don't have some of this look and feel that he really gave to it. But what you find with a lot of artists, and I know everybody in the room totally gets this, is they provide it through their perspective, through their lens of what it looks like to them. And I think that's what you have to appreciate about this artwork, is that this was Grant's ideal landscape. And it was probably the really first landscape that he was really satisfied with his own talent and his design to it. So these are some of the Chesterfield ads from 1929, 1930. I just wanted to share these with you. But it's funny, you see a lot of things during this time period where a lot of the ads would say it satisfies. I saw Prince Albert in a can talked about it satisfies. Wrigley's gum also said it satisfies. That was very much used in the different ads. But once again, I love that he gave that feel and look and mystique to his painting Stone City. And so Elaine asked me to talk a little bit about talking about who I am. And a year ago, actually 2 years now, I wrote a book called Stone Fruit, and it took place mainly in the Stone City area. And a lot of it was because I grew up here. This was actually my school bus route. And we would come from the Biola area, from the left side of this painting. We'd go around that bend, we'd go up that hill to the Ridge Road, and then on east into Anamosa. And this is a print that everybody in Anamosa has on their wall. I grew up with this print in my house. I saw it when I went to school every day. I saw it when I came home every day. I didn't appreciate it. I'll be honest with you. If you talk to a lot of people in Anamosa, we kind of make fun of this painting a little bit, going, we can draw those trees. You know, who is this guy? And didn't really have a lot of appreciation for him or really understood his art or his work. And I have to say, one of the reasons I became such a Grant Wood enthusiast is everything he does in his art is not only about home, but it's also about the attitudes and the values and the sense of humor that I can see in all the people that live in that county. And that's what I love about his work. It reminds me of all the people at home. And I'll try not to get choked up. I live in Southern California now. And one of the reasons I always tell Elaine and Paul and Barbara that I wrote that book is because every day I wrote it, I got to go back home in my mind. But I grew up about 2 miles to the southwest of Stone City. Knew Elaine and I could tell you, we knew all the people that lived in these houses. Still, some of those families are there today. So it's so great to have a painting or at least a print in your house that just reminds you of saying, I knew this place, I knew these people, and I know what it means. So I'm now going to head into the second period. We talked about how Stone City got its start. And you get a sense too that once Portland cement came in at the turn of the century, this little town that was once 2,000 was starting to diminish, right? It was anywhere from maybe 100 to 50 people that lived there. But at the time, Grant Wood had really considered this for his art colony. And I want to share with you all that this wasn't the first time that Grant had thought of an art colony. In fact, it was in Hazel Brown's book, Grant Wood and Marvin Cohn, Artists of an Era, which came out in 1972. She talks about the fact that Grant has started an art colony in Cedar Rapids, actually just on the other side of the river from downtown. He got in one of the Turner mortuary buildings. They had moved to the area of Cedar Rapids we know now, just north of there, the library. And so Grant started to get people to move into this old mortuary. It's kind of this two-story building. He got artists to work there. He got store owners to work out of this building. So in his mind, he's kind of creating this community of artists. So Stone City wasn't his first art colony, you could kind of argue, but we're just so glad that he did pick Stone City to be one of his best art colonies. And so, as many of you know, this is Green Mansion. We're looking at it from probably the south side of the house. I love the ice wagons. Many of you might know the story of the ice wagons, but when Grant Wood actually set up the art colony, he lived just north of Coe College. And many of you know that home there. And that whole neighborhood that was just a couple of blocks surrounding his home, all of those neighbors were the people who helped him put together this art colony. In fact, you see that this photo was from John Berry. John Berry was a neighbor of Grant Wood. Of course, Grant asked him, would you take the photographs here of the art colony, which John did. He got the ice wagons from a neighbor that just lived 2 blocks away from him and his mother. Of course, the ice wagons were meant to be a place where students could live and even decorate as part of the art colony experience. Even Byron McKeeby in American Gothic was just a couple of blocks living from Grant. So I love the fact that Grant really knew community and he leveraged community to create great things. And I love that they all worked with them to really help establish this art colony. So this picture or photo here is of the Stone City Art Colony faculty. And when I started to write my book, Stone Fruit, I remember walking into the store in Anamosa. At that time, it was called the Grant Wood Art Store, or just Grant Wood Store. And I remember this was up on the wall. And this was before anything was out on the internet. You couldn't find any of this information out there. And they were asking all of us locals, do you know who these people are? And I remember people were writing on just a piece of paper, like, I think it's this person, I think it might be that person. But I remember asking the question, what is the art colony? And of course, the person in the Grant Wood store loved someone like me who didn't know much about it and just loved to talk about all of this. But of course, as many of you know, the art colony was in the summers of 1932 and 33. Grant was hoping to continue the art colony summer over summer, but unfortunately, financially, they didn't do very well. But what I love again is that Grant really leveraged, once again, people that he knew would really support a lot of the different types of classes that he wanted to house here at the art colony. And I'll show you some of the names of the people that were here. But you see Grace Boston, she was actually their business manager at the art colony. Adrian Dornbush, of course, was one of the founders of the art colony. He was an instructor. He was a consultant for the colony, but also was a director at the Flint Art Institute. Of course, you've got Grant in those signature overalls, which we all love. And then Ed Rowan, as many of you know, too, was one of the founders of the art colony. He ran the little gallery in Cedar Rapids, bringing a lot of the culture and art to Cedar Rapids at that time. Jefferson Smith has an incredible, interesting background. He actually ended up marrying Florence Sprague there to his left, but he was also a business manager, and he was also the son of an outlaw called Soapy Smith. So if you ever want to learn more about that, I know, Paul, you've done some of that homework too on Soapy Smith, but his father was an outlaw in the Colorado and Alaska area. So the point is, there's story after story with all of these people. And then I think many of you know Marvin Cohn, Grant Wood's great friend, high school pal, as well as a great artist in his own right. And then, of course, Winifred Cohn is Marvin's wife. And then Arnold Pyle, you probably recognize him. Grant Wood did a portrait, the coming of age of Arnold Pyle, and then Dennis Burlingame. too, who also has a fascinating background in his artistry. And Dennis Burlingame was also someone who, it was in, what was it, Paul? It would have been the Ice House. He was the bartender there. Yep. So they all had many roles, but go ahead, Paul. You look like you're going to say something.
Yeah, I think that bar was called the Sickle and Sheaf.
Yes.
I don't know the exact title, but Sue Harris, I know, or Sue Taylor, I know, I did some research and found out that that name of the tavern was taken from a movie that was being shown in Cedar Rapids that summer, of the first summer of the art colony, and that they had taken it off of the name of a motion picture.
Yes. Oh, that's excellent. Thank you so much for that. And then Florence Sprague, last but not least, she was a professor of sculpture at Drake University. And what I love is, many of you know the name Isabelle Bloom that I'm going to talk about here in a few minutes, but she's the one that really worked with Isabelle Bloom here at the Art Colony, teaching Isabelle how to become a sculptress. And I'm going to talk about that story here in a moment. But I based my book Stone Fruit on what you see in front of you is these stone baskets. And these were pillars in front of the mansion. There was a stone fruit basket, and then on the other side was a basket of flowers. And I just thought that that was an incredible piece, that it was made in the Champion Quarry by Johnny Green and his team. And it actually was a showpiece that they took for an exhibit at the World's Fair to Chicago in, let me see if I can remember the date, 1893. So Isabelle Bloom, I told you that I stopped at the Anamosa Grant Wood store, starting to research my story. And I walked in and saw all these photos and pictures, wanting to learn more about the native son of Anamosa. And how I got curious is I actually had gone to the Metropolitan Museum in New York on a trip that my husband took me on. And he said, you need to see this place. And I said, oh, it's New York, it's Christmas time. Who wants to go to an art museum? I'd rather go shopping. But my husband said, nope, you need to go to the Met. You need to see all of this. Well, we walked into the Met, and there was this exhibit of the regional artists. And there was the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere by Grant Wood. There was paintings by Thomas Hart Benton, and of course by John Stuart Curry of Kansas. And I had never seen or even heard of the regionalists, but I remember seeing the painting by Grant Wood, The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, thinking, gosh, that guy from home, he did really well. And I'm just saying that and kind of laughing because that shows just how much I didn't know about this local talent in my own backyard. But it got me curious, and it got me to come home. And so when I was in that Anamosa store, I asked the question, is there anybody who's still living from the art colony? And the woman there said, yes, her name is Isabelle Bloom. And I had no idea who Isabelle was. I was living in Colorado at the time. I didn't know a lot of the local things. So I just assumed Isabelle was probably someone who lived in Anamosa, retired with her family and husband. And I could just go to the local phone booth and find her. Well, I was wrong. And in fact, it took a good friend of mine, her mother, to tell me, actually, Isabelle Bloom is a big deal. And she lives in Davenport. And she's got this incredible pieces of sculpture that she does. You need to go, talk to her in Davenport. And I said, that's really interesting. I said, I'm heading to Davenport. I was taking my son to a hockey camp and having no idea who Isabelle Bloom was. So I go to Davenport and I learn about Isabelle. And I find that she was at the Stone City Art Colony. You're going to see a blue arrow come up. That's Isabelle. Her soon-to-be husband was behind her in this picture. She was someone who, she was there the summers of 32 and 33. She would go down to the quarry. She'd ask the guys to help her lug up a big piece of limestone to the mansion. She'd sit on the front steps as she was trying to learn to sculpt. Well, lo and behold, this groundskeeper by the name of John Bloom, of course, she was Isabelle Shearer at the time. He was teasing her about making a big mess that he had to clean up. Well, of course, those two fell in love. And what was interesting, I had started to write a book about these two living people from the art colony that fell in love. And little did I know I was writing the story of something that was actually true. The Blooms did fall in love here at the Stone City Art Colony and went on to do some really incredible things, which I'll talk about here in a moment. So I go to Davenport. This is the early 2000s, and I find out that I got to meet Isabelle and her husband, John, probably a year before both of them passed. They were both in very fragile health when I met them. Isabelle had just sold her store. And in fact, the day that I went to her store to figure out who is this woman, there was this long line up to the door. And I remember asking someone at the end of the line, why are all these people here? And the woman said, well, actually, it's because, these sculptures are kind of like precious moments. They get retired, and some of the pieces are being retired today. So I stood in that long line. I went inside this little store and I said, can I meet Isabelle Bloom? And of course, the clerk kind of laughs at me and said, oh, honey, she retired about 5 years ago. And I was so disappointed. I said, does she live anywhere around here? And they said, yeah, actually, she lives a couple of blocks away. And I didn't want to pester them, so I didn't ask for her address. But as I walked this little store that you see to the right, on a chalkboard on the wall was a phone number, a 319 phone number. And I knew in that moment that had to be Isabelle's phone number, because in my mind, it was like only in Iowa would someone be that transparent, that honest to say, here's my phone number. So I wrote it down. I left this building and I went to a payphone. And shakingly, I called this phone number. And I heard them say, Bloom residence. And I said, is Isabelle there? And they said, who's calling? And I could tell it was probably a housekeeper, someone who was keeping guard of the Blooms. And I didn't know what to say. And I said, well, I'm writing a book about Stone City and the art colony. And right away, those were the magic words. And they said, come back tomorrow at 1 o'clock. And so Isabelle just lived 2 blocks from her shop. I mean, it was just right up the street. And I didn't even know that I was writing a book at the time. It just kind of hit me. I think I'm going to write a book. And I go to their house. And of course, Isabelle, bless her heart, had Parkinson's. And they said that's why we had to come back the next 24 hours. They said she was in poor health yesterday. But bless her heart, she talked to me. And when I asked her about Stone City, and this is why Elaine was teasing me at the start of tonight's session, she just kept saying over and over again, Stone City is a magical place. Stone City is a magical place. And I've never forgotten that. And then off in the living room was a gentleman sleeping on a day bed, and it happened to be John Bloom, her husband, who is one of the last of the regional artists. And as you'll find, John Bloom only went to the art colony because Grant Wood basically said, John said, Grant, I don't have any money to go to your art colony, but I'd love to go. And Grant said, you be my groundskeeper and you can go. And so that's how John got to go to the art colony. But once again, they were a lovely couple. I have to just joke with this crew that John got up. I think at the time he might have had a little bit of form of dementia. I'll never forget, he went into the bathroom, he used the bathroom, he came back out, wanted to shake my hand. And I just remember going, because his hand was wet. And I remember just feeling kind of silly and awkward. But they showed me their art collection, which was really, they had a hobby or an interest around a lot of the artifacts from Russia, the crosses, the crucifixes, a lot of the paintings that were thrown out of those churches around Russia and Prague. And they had that in a room, and they estimated what was in that room to be over $2 million worth of artifacts that they had, collected over the years. And as many of you know, she had a TV show on WOC, doing art for children. And of course, she did these wonderful sculptures that if you go to ibloom.com, you'll see her legacy of sculptures, but they were really made out of cement. A lot of the ideas came from her childhood. She says she used to look into puddles and see faces of figurines and sculptures that she knew she would make one day, and loved children. So of course, a lot of her sculptures were of children. But she soon passed away, but I'll never forget asking her too, one last question, tell me about Grant Wood. And she said, he was just this father figure, when we would have dinner at the art colony, like on a Saturday or Sunday night, he always sat at the head of the table, but always making sure that everybody was getting what they need. Everybody was happy. And she just had nothing but great things to say. And in fact, John Bloom said Grant Wood was a great man. And so that started a lot of my story too, about writing about this ice wagon. This was Grant Wood's ice wagon. He was, of course, had gone to Estes Park, Colorado. At the time, I lived in Colorado, so I love this because that does look like Estes Park. And of course, he got a lot of the art students to really paint and draw on their ice wagons. I would have loved to seen that whole scene of all those ice wagons in a row of people doing their artistic work on them. And of course, the ice wagons, they slept in them either near Green's mansion, or they pulled them down to the river to bathe and to sleep near the Wapsie Pinnakin. And there's a lot of stories of how the ice wagons got to Stone City. Some believe they came down the Wapsie, but that's not true. I think they came down Highway 151 overnight, making a lot of noise based on the tires associated with the ice wagons, but brought them in overnight. And once again, Grant got a lot of these things for free, just giving free tuition and allowing people to come and just enjoy the art colony. And then this one is for Elaine. This is Biola, Iowa. And a lot of the art students would just get in their cars and go out in the Iowa countryside to paint. Grant really believed in getting the students out to just paint, draw different landscapes that appealed to them. And this is actually in Biola. And the reason we know that is the house in the background there was an octagon shaped house. Elaine and I grew up with the family that lived there. We knew them very well. They were the Harts. And so, and this is also property that sits high above the street, about 2 to 3 feet. So they're kind of up high over a sidewalk on someone's front yard, which Elaine, I believe this was once your grandfather's front yard. Is that accurate to say?
Yeah, I think it was a great grandfather. Yeah.
And Elaine just lived up the street, just maybe about 4 houses, and I lived about a mile to the south. So that's how close we grew up. But I love this picture because I love to think about the artist being in the countryside painting. And in fact, I have an aunt that talks about Anamosa, that she would get up early in the morning with her father, who had the milk route in Anamosa, pulling milk with a horse and a cart. And he would go up and down the streets of Anamosa selling milk. And he'd also went out to the art colony to sell milk. But in doing so, he would see the artists up and down the streets of Anamosa in the summertime, just painting and all along the countryside. Grant just really encouraged everybody to get out and experience everything. And I believe this looks like that's Marvin Cohn in the background. I see Paul shaking his head. That looks a little bit like Adrian Dornbush there too, but hard to know. So one of the pieces tonight is I want to show you a lot of the people that came through Stone City. You know, we talked about the Cox Brothers, we talked about Weidelbeck doing the church. I mean, there's some incredible people that have come through that town. And one of them is John Stewart Curry, another regionalist from the state of Kansas. And the story goes is that John Stewart Curry always wanted to know why Grant Wood was so beloved by the state of Iowa. Now, Curry didn't feel that in Kansas, even though he did a lot of paintings of Kansas. He did the mural in the state capitol. He often painted things that Kansans weren't quite proud of, like tornadoes and baptisms and things like that. So he's very curious of Grant. And in fact, he saw the painting Stone City and said, there's no such place like that. That's too perfect. That's too surreal. Until he came to Eastern Iowa and saw Stone City. And this is pictures of him visiting at Green Mansion. He was just blown away by that area and what it looked like. And in fact, Grant had him doing a little bit of teaching for a couple of weeks. In fact, he slept in Grant's ice wagon. I love the practicality of all these folks, but had planned to come back in the summer of 34 to teach. But as we know, the art colony was not in existence in 1934. But I love some of the paintings by John Stewart Curry. This is the Tragic Prelude. I actually have this print in my house. I love it because it talks about, you know, the border wars. And of course, I had a grandfather who grew up on the Kansas-Missouri borders and would tell a lot of these stories. And so this reminds me a lot of my grandfather, but also did Tornado over Kansas. And once again, the people of Kansas didn't always like being reminded of the things that took some of their home values down, the prices down, because nobody wanted to move where there was a lot of tornadoes. And of course, my son's in the audience tonight, and I have to tease him a little bit that this painting of this boy with the black cat looks exactly like my son. And so when I first saw this painting, I was blown away. I'm like, that is my son in a painting by John Stewart Curry of Kansas. So some other people that we could claim as some of our native sons to Stone City and daughter is Paul and Mary Nissen Engel. You remember I told you that when John A. Green had to sell his mansion and his quarry, he sold the 10 acres to the Nissen family. They were from Blairstown, living in Cedar Rapids, and it was Mary's father, Frank, that bought that property. Well, in 1936-37, Paul and Mary got married and started to live in Green Mansion as their summer home. Now, a little bit about Paul, everyone to join, remember this, but you remember Barbara Feller, and Barbara jump in. But Paul Engel was a young man who had a newspaper route in Cedar Rapids, just north of where the museum is today, where the public library is today. Paul and Mary both lived in that area. Well, Paul, as a young boy, had a newspaper route, and J. Sigmund was one of his customers. And the story goes is that J. Sigmund influenced Paul Engel to become a poet. Of course, Jay would invite him in saying, hey, I've got this latest poetry that I want to share with you. Of course, Paul would listen, and eventually Paul started to bring his poetry to J. Sigmund. So you can see this community just north of downtown that was growing. You've got Marvin Cone in that area. You've got Grant Wood in that area. In fact, they all went to the same high school. They went to George Washington High School. That was the old Washington High School, was where the Cedar Rapids Public Library is today. And this is where they all went to high school. And in fact, Paul was about 2 or 3 grades ahead of Mary, but they started to date in high school. Paul goes to college at Coe College. He eventually goes to the University of Iowa to get his master's. And Mary ends up going to New York City to Pratt Institute to become a lithographer and to become a designer, graphic designer. So one of the things that I want to share a lot tonight is this other story in Green Mansion. So you've got Paul and Mary. They eventually get married in 36. They come back. They live in Iowa City, where Paul's teaching in the English department. And then he becomes the director of the Iowa Writers Workshop. But Stone City is their summer home. And when they went to that mansion was still pretty much the way Grant left it. There wasn't a lot of electricity in that mansion. In fact, they often had to go to, I'm going to step back, they often had to go to Anamosa to get water. We had really good family friends that talked about the fact that Paul would come to see them. He'd sit on their couch, he'd throw one leg up over the end of the couch, and he would be there talking and sharing some of the latest work that he was doing, but he was really there to get water from a friend. So that mansion, very dark, not a lot of electricity. So they kind of lived off the land, you could say, in Stone City. But what happened with Paul is Paul also got a fellowship at Columbia University, and then he became a Rhodes Scholar in Oxford, England. And while he was at Columbia, Mary once again was going to school at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, and that's kind of where they started to meet up again. And in fact, Paul writes his thesis on what's called Worn Earth. He then writes his second book, which you can see, American Song. It ends up being on the New York Times book reviews front page, saying he's a new voice in American poetry. So think of this young couple, their life is just taking off. But Mary actually designed the front cover of his book. So the reason I talk about Mary is Mary's interesting because not only does her dad own Green Mansion, but her dad rented the Green Mansion to Grant Wood. She came to the art colony for the 2 summers. She would have been in college, coming back to the art colony and attending the art colony. And then here she meets a director who's soon to be running the Iowa Writers Workshop and also a well-known poet. So I love the fact you've got all these artists focus on many of the same things, all finding home Stone City, calling it their home. So here's some picture of Paul at the Writers Workshop. The Writers Workshop started in Quonset huts. And in fact, when Paul was first there, he was in the English department. It was about 3 years later that he started to be the director of the Writers Workshop. But he's right across the river from the art building where Grant was teaching. So here were these 2 people. They grew up in the same area of Cedar Rapids. Paul Engel was actually in 8th grade. Grant Wood was his art teacher. They also both displayed a lot of their work in the same galleries around Cedar Rapids. Their paths were always crossing. So I find it really interesting that they both ended up in Iowa City, right across the river from each other for 3 years, but often connecting through mutual friends, mutual focus, and things that they were working on. And I love to think of these two native sons, both at the University of Iowa. So coming back to the Green Mansion, I want to share with you a lot of the great writers of the day came to Stone City because of Paul Engel. In fact, even actors came to Stone City, like Robert Montgomery. Many of you might have heard of that actor from the 1950s. His daughter was Elizabeth Montgomery, that was on the show Bewitched. But he came to visit Paul Engel here at Stone City. In fact, he was on his way to visit President Eisenhower. Robert Montgomery was going to be kind of the consultant for Eisenhower because TV was coming into the presence. And Eisenhower wanted to know how to look really good on TV. So he hired Robert Montgomery to be his consultant. But before Robert Montgomery headed to Washington, D.C., he stopped off at Stone City to see Paul Engel, a good friend of his. Another piece with the Stone City with Green Mansion is Paul's office was on the 3rd floor. There wasn't a lot of electricity up there. In fact, a friend of ours tells us that she used to be afraid to go into Green Mansion. She was very good friends with Paul's daughters. But once again, all those upper floors didn't have a lot of lighting, didn't have a lot of electricity, and the mansion was very cold and dark. But for someone who's just wanting to write and be secluded, it was the perfect place. American Child was a book also that Paul wrote, and some of the sonnets and some of the writings from American Child was in Life magazine, September 23rd, 1946. Now, Paul Engel had quite the network. He was aligned to a lot of publishers. He was aligned to Life magazine, a lot of magazines. He knew all the publishers. In fact, that's why he was so great at the Iowa Writers Workshop. He had the network that anybody would die for, and he knew what it took to get published. Well, American Child was sonnets that he wrote for his daughters, Mary and Sarah. So his wife was a Mary, but he had a daughter. His oldest one was a Mary. They called her Munchie, and they called Sarah Rhodey. That was just some of the pet names for them. And here's some of the pictures from the Life magazine from September of 1946. But this is Mary. She's playing in the Wapsipinicon. She's in Paul's office on the 3rd floor of the mansion. I grabbed this Life magazine because I've always wanted to, but there wasn't much there that I would have liked. But they were wonderful sonnets, and he actually updated the book to produce more sonnets to include his second daughter, Sarah, on that. But once again, Mary and Sarah often played with a lot of the kids in the Anamosa Stone City area. They created a lot of friendships there. So much so that I'm going to actually step back, that when the mansion did get on fire, which was Veterans Day 1963, Paul and his wife and kids were not in the mansion, but the locals saw the smoke coming out of the 3rd floor of the mansion. And because the Engels had befriended so many people across 20 years in that community, the neighborhood knew exactly what to do. They called the fire department. In fact, the neighbors got into the mansion. They went up to the 3rd floor and they grabbed all of Paul's papers. And if it wasn't for that neighborhood in Stone City, Paul would have lost all of that because most of his writing was in Stone City. And I just think what wonderful neighbors to have that knew exactly what you would want to save if there was a fire in your house, and they went in there and saved it for Paul. But it was after that fire that Paul and Mary never returned to Stone City, but spent many happy years there. There was something too that many people in Anamosa know about, is that it's a film called Small Town USA. It was actually filmed in Anamosa in 1957. It was part of a propaganda piece, actually, that the United States was doing, sending these films over to Europe to show life in small rural communities across places like Iowa. And who was behind all of that was Paul Engel. Paul actually talked with Bob Wallace from Life magazine, who was commissioned to work with the government to create these kind of projects, to create this kind of stories. He actually had Paul consult on this. He even asked Paul to be a narrator on this But when you hear the narration, I think they probably grab somebody else. But you can see this on YouTube. You just on YouTube put in Small Town USA Anamosa, and it's about a 50-minute piece, but it's based on the fact that they followed a quarter throughout the business district of Anamosa. So you saw this day in a life of Anamosa, all following the prosperity of a quarter that goes through the neighborhoods and the businesses of Anamosa. So Paul did a lot of things for this area. In fact, the Anamosa newspaper often wrote about everything Paul was doing, all the writings he was doing, all the trips he was making to New York to work with a lot of known publishers, governors, a lot of incredible people that he brought back to the Iowa City landscape, connecting his young writers with all of these folks. And one of the things too, I thought I would show it tonight, but we're running out of time. But if you look at another video, this is on the Stone City Foundation website. It's called Stone City Study of a Community. There is footage of what the Green Mansion looked like after the fire. And as Elaine remembers, a lot of us got the opportunity to play up in those ruins. That was our first introduction to, the history of Stone City, of the art colony, of the quarries. Back in the day, a lot of us could just, do I dare say it, trespass up there and go look at all the ruins of what was once this grandeur of artists and their world. So the next piece I wanted to show you, and we're on the home stretch here, is all the artists that were influenced by Paul Engel, or he brought them to Iowa City. People like Kurt Vonnegut, Flannery O'Connor, Phil Roth. The list goes on and on. Robert Bly, Philip Levine. It's just incredible. And I apologize, I'm looking for my notes on all these wonderful people, but he brought these incredible writers to Iowa City who left quite a legacy, not only of their own writing, but of their time in Iowa City. And I can't say enough, and I don't have the time to go into it, but sometimes I don't think, I'll just say it, that Bill gets the due that he's worth. He brought a lot of fame to Iowa. He brought a lot of importance. He really started the careers of writers who didn't know how they would make a living at writing, and he showed them how to do it. And very much like Grant Wood, struggled with the University of Iowa toward the end of his tenure, so much that he ended up leaving the program and starting the international writing program with his then second wife, Waline Engel. And in fact, they were nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize in starting this piece in 1967. So I feel like here's a man who lived in the same neighborhood as Grant Wood, was inspired by the same people, lived in the same areas such as Grant, Iowa City, Stone City, worked for the University of Iowa just over the river from Grant, but basically had the same kind of struggle that Grant did with the University of Iowa, and really, I would say, honoring some of their native sons. And that's why I wanted to write about both of them and talk about both of them tonight. So I'll leave you with this poem by Paul Engel. Lucky the living child born in a land bordered by rivers of enormous flow, Missouri talking through its throat of sand, Mississippi wide with ice and snow. A country confident that day or night, planting, plowing, or at evening rest, it has a trust like childhood, free of fright, having such powers to hold it east and west. Water edged with willow gray or green, edges the hours and meadows where she plays, where the black earth and the bright time are piled. She lives between those rivers as between her birth and death, as in these both days. A water washed, a river radiant child. And this is from American Child that he wrote for his daughters. So as we think about Stone City, it definitely is an artist's paradise. It's where artists go to dream. What I really want you all to walk away with is I think Iowa should be extremely proud of its native sons. We've had some incredible people that have touched this earth. They touched this world. They have done nothing but just love the craft that they were here and meant to do. And I just hope that us as a group, as a collective group, will continue to remember them, continue to honor them, and keep their legacies alive.
Oh, Thank you so much, Dorothy. That was just spectacularly beautiful too. You just so captured Stone City because, I mean, it just is the myth, the legend.
Yes, it is.
I mean,
And it was in,
yeah.
and as
there's a
Elaine
lot-
and I say, sorry, Elaine, go ahead.
No, go ahead. No.
Oh, and this was all in our backyard and a lot of us didn't know it. And I think that's why we're here doing these series, is because this was our childhood and we had no idea. And people in our area, they kind of knew it, but yet, we just kind of, I don't know. One thing I will say is I'm so proud of Anamosa for keeping the Grant Wood days going and the Grant Wood, focus, because when you think about what Grant Wood went through with the University of Iowa and his legend being almost, kept away, closed away. I'm so proud of our home area for keeping a lot of his legacy alive during a really rough time. And I just see that as our path here, with this group and tonight.
And I will say that, not all places in Iowa are the same. There's lots of wonderful, dynamic, historic, beautiful places in Iowa. They have their personalities all the same. And this is just one of those gems that happens to be deeply connected to an iconic, name in American culture. And rightly so. The good news is you can still go to Stone City and a lot of it's still there. And a lot of it, you could just, the painting, it's recognizable that that's where that painting was done. So I think that's a really neat thing about that as well. So thank you so much, Dorothy, and all those wonderful pictures and images that were just like, went on and on and on and on. And I'm like, what's she drummed up?
Well, and I could talk about the Paul Engel piece. So I'm writing a second book called The Stone City Author. And in the book, you'll have to decide if that's Grant Wood or if that's Paul Engel. So I'll just leave it there.
Very good. See, that's great. That's great to have something to look forward to that way. And as our session is wrapping up, I do want to remind people who maybe missed the beginning of this that next week it will be Debbie Beilstein and Dorothy back to talk about Portrait of Nan, and there's going to be a lot to learn about that. I mean, there's just a lot. And then the week after that will be our next reading session. So we switched the next two sessions. And our reading session, that one on the 21st will not be recorded. And then on the 28th, we'll look forward to Paul regaling us with the birthplace of Herbert Hoover and all the things that he's been doing around Herbert Hoover, another famous Iowa legend for sure. So the legends unite, right, Paul? And then on April 4th is our final session, and that's the one that we'll kind of try to program out and record that as kind of a memento of some of the things folks have created. So in the chat, I want to make sure I check that before we leave. And again, the recordings can be found on Cedar Rapids Public Library's YouTube channel, and give them a week or so lag time to get those up and running, but they've been making it happen. Is there anything else that we need to talk about before we close up this session? Anybody have any questions or anything?
Well, it's always fun to have some things to look for, I think, quirky little things. But I went through some of the old newspapers from the area, and one thing it did say that I thought had some interest to it is that Mr. Green, he created a monument that's in Key West, and Key West is kind of a western suburb of Dubuque, the Key City, so Key West. And it's on the grave. It was done in 1882, and it's on the grave of Sister Hennessy, presented by Mr. Green, and she was a superioress of the Presentation Convent in Dubuque. And I just thought that would be really interesting to go to the cemetery, see if you could find that tombstone and see if it has any uniqueness to it or what that's all about. The other thing was that Dorothy mentioned about the Cox brothers, and I found an interview some time ago about an old man in 1932 that was living in Columbia Hall when they went for the colony. And he said this, he said, on the stage was the same old curtain painted many years ago at the order of Mr. Green by the Cox brothers of New Orleans. They sat atop the Dearborn quarry and painted all they could see of the Stone City village from that point. The years have made the canvas fade, but the outlines are still there. And Grant Wood, an instructor at the colony, has signified his intention of rejuvenating the painting to its original glory. Now, wouldn't it be fun if we could find that somewhere? So I'll give you that as an assignment, maybe if we can find it.
I'd love it. I'd love it. And I'm going to put someone on the spot tonight, but very important. Teresa, I'm going to put you on the spot. Teresa, you want to come on and say who you're related to?
I forgot I was muted. So my mom was a Dearborn. So the behind Dorothy, the barn there you can see goes with the house that you can't see across from the general store.
So Teresa, everybody was asking tonight, was that ever a bed and breakfast? But you've had family members living there since it was built,
the beginning,
right?
Right. So about 4 years ago now, probably it sold to another family. But in all those years, it had always been a Dearborn had lived there. So we had Christmas Eve out there every year, and yeah. So no, it's not ever been a bed and breakfast.
Okay.
Although they've had a lot of company.
And someone was asking about, Teresa, the Ronan mansion, that
Yes.
was once, I believe, a bed and breakfast, and you were just
Yes.
up there last fall, I believe.
Yes, it was about a year ago, and
A year ago?
it's just kind of deserted right now. It's still got some furniture in it. The people who own it have moved away, and they've just left it. We snuck back. We basically did trespass there. I mean, we pulled down the driveway and snuck right down there and looked. And I wish they'd sell it to somebody who cared, because it's just sitting there right now. But it was a gift shop. It's been a lot of things over the years. And we also always went running around that green mansion. I don't think we even knew about the word trespassing at the time. It's just our playground.
I write in my book, Stone Fruit, about my campfire troop going up to Green Mansion, and that's all a true story. We actually did that. Elaine, I'm guessing you were with me because you were in my campfire group, but we did hike all the way from Biola on the railroad tracks. The back way came into Green Mansion. You're right, Teresa. That was like a playground. We didn't even worry about that we were trespassing, and we always thought that area would exist. And now everybody's built homes around there. It's hard to tell where the mansion was at.
Right.
I just wonder what bead we were earning on that.
Hopefully
It
an art
seems
bead.
like a long trip to me.
I have 3 quick little tidbits if we have time. Do we have time?
Hopefully, yeah. Go for it.
I'll hang on here. I'll hang on.
Yeah.
I read an interview with John Ely Sr., and it would have been Roby Kessler, in which John tells about he was the head of a bank in Cedar Rapids, and he took the train to Stone City from Cedar Rapids to meet with Mr. Green, who was seeking a loan. And this was at the time of the Portland cement devastation to the economy of the quarries. But he said that he thought that Mr. Green was a wonderful man and admired all he had done, but he could not approve the loan. So unfortunately, that would have been one of the nails in the coffin there for the Green Quarry. So that was just one. Tidbit number 2, last time Nancy Mortimer talked about how Grant had done those overalls and there was a pocket, and you were speculating that it was for paintbrushes. I was reading the Wanda Corn book today, and she said that the pocket was where Grant kept his liquor. So it was sort of his bar.
I don't think it would have been big enough for that.
Oh, really? Well, that's what Wanda was speculating. And then the third thing is that on the gates going into Brucemore, there are also those stone fruit, what do you call them? It's like a statue, but it's like a vase with the fruit in it.
Yeah.
And on either
Also-
side at the top of those tall gates are two of those stone fruit.
Oh.
Give me a name for that.
Really?
A pedestal? Like a pedestal?
And the fruit. So that was really, I just noticed them the last time I was at Brucemore. I was really surprised. I had never noticed them in all my like 70 years of viewing those days. Anyway, so, the connection with probably the Douglases and Grant Wood and Green Mansion and everything. But this group has made me so aware of all these little tidbits around the town that now have great significance.
Absolutely. And before I forget, I wanted to go back to Mary Nissen. Many of you know that her brother was the inventor of the trampoline. I think everybody knows that. Yep. And I think I was telling Joe Coffey the other day that Mary Nissen too was in New York City when Grant did his first show in 1935. And she attended that show. Many of you can find the guest list online and seen some of the dignitaries that went to that show. But one of them was Mary Nissen. And I would have loved to have been there when she walked in to say to her teacher, you could say, 'cause she went to his art colony for 2 summers. Hey, teacher, it's great to see you in New York and see you having your own show. So there's just so many connections.
Another tidbit about stone fruit. This is Marvin Cohn's painting Stone Fruit. It's on the 2nd floor of the library at Coe College. It's toward the back.
Oh my gosh. I just heard that there was a stone fruit. I think Paul shared that with me, but I didn't realize it was at Coe.
I didn't either. One thing that I just want to throw in here, it's kind of a silly thing, but some years ago, I read in the paper where they were going to have a mass at St. Joseph's in Stone City. So a friend of mine, Marla Stunfy, and I decided we'd drive out and go to the mass. But before we did, we decided we'd go down into the quarries. And of course, there were signs saying no trespassing, as you were talking about trespassing. I said, oh, it's okay, it's Sunday. There are no workers there. So we walked in and we went into the big caverns, and there's bats flying out of it. It's quite an experience to be back in those. Well, a woman was in a house nearby and she came running over screaming at us and saying, can't you read? Don't you know English? This is no trespassing. You could get hurt in here and we'd be liable. Now you get your something out of here real quick. So we did, as we were supposed to. And so we went up and waited for mass to begin. While we go into mass, guess who is serving communion? The same woman that chased us out of the cave. And we both felt so silly going up and taking communion from her after she had scolded us like school kids. So just a quick.
Paul, did you ask her for forgiveness? And
I did. I really did. I did.
I'm pretty sure I know who that is.
Yeah. Well, she was doing her job. I'm not faulting her at all.
Oh my gosh. Well, that these are the delightful tidbits you'll only get if you linger among people like this group, right?
Yeah.
And Elaine, I just want to really fortify what you said. That's why we're doing this series is we know there's art scholars around art that know this work so much better than we do. But what we're hoping to do is give you perspective from, just like you all are, the local people of Iowa, and to give our perspective and stories that you can't get anywhere else, stories that you've all shared. And we just want to keep sharing the stories. So we hope you'll go on this journey with us.
Thank you so much, Dorothy. And please come back. And by the way, the YouTube channel is up to date. There was no forum session on the 21st of February. Last week's session was an unrecorded reading session. So that was kind of a warm up. Okay. This session will be uploaded fairly soon, I'm certain. and as will next week's session. And then the session on the 21st will not be recorded. That'll be another reading session for all of us to kind of flex our creative muscles without the pressure of a recording, you know, doing that. Our own little safe, sacred space in that regard. And then Paul will be back on the 28th, and on April 4th, we'll regale the world with our recordings of our creative musings and whatnot. So that's kind of the way that this is going to end up. So thank you all for being together with us on this journey, and can't wait to see everybody again next week. So everybody
Thank
take
you.
care.
Thank you, Dorothy.